thank you for inviting me today to talk about this hot topic. And obviously continuing on from the talk we've just had, mentioning about the marking of human remains. I just want to say I'm also the chair of OsteoSig, and I've consulted on my committee about this talk. So some of this isn't just my personal views. So what I was going to do today is look at how the actual practice that we do in the various commercial units that I was saying we discussed in our committee, how that actually varies from the standards and guidance documents that are currently out there. So what do we have? We have a lot of documents for human remains. It's really very popular for everybody to have a go at. And these are just a few of them that are available. And as other people have found, there aren't actually that many that detail exactly what to do from the second they come in off the field, you know, about the washing and the marking and things like that. So quite a few of those ones don't actually mention anything to do with that practical side of things at all. So then how does this differ? So looking at one of the oldest documents is the CIfA technical paper from 1993, technical paper 13. This is one of the earliest papers published looking at standards, and it actually does detail how to treat the human remains when you bring them in off the field. And on the topic of marking, it says all the bone should be marked with its unique ID number in Indian ink, and so on and so forth. And it was quite interesting, actually, when we had this discussion in our group, and one of the authors of this paper, Jackie McKinley, said that when they were putting this paper together, there were three authors and they were putting this paper together, she had strongly advocated that this part wasn't actually in there. And she then went on holiday. And when she came back, it had gone to print with this inserted in. So, you know, this was a controversial decision even back in 1993. There was a differing of opinion as to whether human remains should be marked or not. And this paper has obviously then gone on to influence all the papers ever since. All the other guidance documents refer back to this one. There is actually an earlier paper, I think it's from 1988. There's something I found as well about that. So yes, so you also, the only other document really that mentions it is the DCMS guidelines 2005, and now obviously the more recent stuff as well, which again says skeletal remains should be marked with ink. Although it's quite interesting that it then says not always acceptable for those from other cultures. And that got me thinking, why is it not acceptable for those from other cultures, but it is perfectly acceptable to apply to British skeletons? And that was just something to think about. Why are British human remains different to those not from Britain? They're all human remains at the end of the day. So the more recent up-to-date standards from Babio, Code of Practice 2019, also says, you know, please mark them with pen or Indian ink, avoiding areas of significance. And again, it was interesting discussing this in our group that that is actually the second updated paper, and the earlier version didn't actually have that in, so that has also been changed recently. So what happens in practice? Well, as you can see from these images, can I point out now, this is not from my current employer as well. These fine examples of the practice people when they mark human remains to the varying degrees of success in which they follow these guidelines. And not everybody knows what areas of a skeleton are not appropriate, even though it says don't write on where the pathology is, don't write on an articular surface, don't write in very large writing or anything like that. A lot of people, you know, they're just archaeologists or they're volunteers, or, you know, they just are just in because it's wet on site or something. They're just not that bothered. And so this is what you end up with. And these are recent examples, fairly recent anyway. I think it's 2014. So we're not talking about antiquarian stuff or stuff from the 1930s. So as you can see, they're writing inappropriately on very small things like teeth, which is an example we had earlier from Wales as well. And these other ones here are on articular surfaces, and that patella there, you can see the shiny bit there, that's ebonation, so that's pathology. So these are all being written on completely the wrong bits of the human skeletons. So in my opinion, really, there's just too much opportunity to get it wrong. And there are lots of exceptions to which bits of the skeleton you shouldn't be marking. It's also incredibly time consuming. Unfortunately, as we all know in British archaeology, not every single skeleton you dig out of the ground is just the 206 bones of the human body. They're usually in lots and lots of little pieces. So you end up with lots and lots of tiny, tiny bits. And should we be marking all those little tiny, weeny bits? And we don't need it. Osteologists do not need this writing. It doesn't help us in any way and actually hinders in lots of other circumstances. And as also, as you're saying about the isotopes and things like that, that causes problems if we then want to sample that area. So we don't need it. And is it unethical? I personally, since I started in archaeology, feel that actually we shouldn't be marking human remains. I think it's quite unethical and disrespectful. These are not objects, these were people. So what happens in actual practice? So again, amongst the survey, I've said quite a few, just a limited number of people in our committee, all of us felt very strongly that we shouldn't be marking human remains, and we don't unless we really, really have to. So it's only way the museum will absolutely insist it will not accept the archive otherwise. And if that is the case, we also try to negotiate the level of marking. So it's not every single tiny fragment, it may be just a selection of bones from each individual. We will say where the collection goes to teaching, to a university or anything like that, then yes, the remains do need marking because there's a very high chance of them getting commingled and mixed up. So that is quite important. But that is going to necessarily not be on the individual company to do. That will probably be on the university who's accepting the remains. And where they go on display, again, there's a high chance of things getting mixed up or whatever. So, you know, it is necessary to mark for those instances. Right, sorry, I'll just go back to this. I was listening to a talk by somebody from the Tetrarchs, Transforming Data Reuse in Archaeology group. And they were talking about how de-accessioning human remains from museums. And it was interesting that they were saying that actually these human remains that have been collected over the years, the markings on them have actually enabled them to de-accession them, to return them to the countries, because those markings have managed to, they've traced it all back with the paperwork and everything like that. And they've actually, without those markings, they wouldn't actually be able to say, these are the right ones, and they can be de-accessioned and they can be taken back to where they came from. So there's a sort of balance, I think, somewhere to be met here between we need to know and identify the remains, but also on the flip side of that, when these remains have been de-accessioned and gone back to the original country they're from, the people are horrified by the markings on the human remains, and they actually find it really offensive. So it's a very difficult thing. So although, you know, on one side, no, don't mark it, it's wrong, it's unethical, but on the flip side of that is it actually has helped to, you know, repatriate these remains. So that was an interesting thought I hadn't really considered before. So one of the other issues, apart from marking human remains, that I was thinking, what are the problems that I come across on a daily basis, is storage. And what we don't talk about a lot is cremated remains, which obviously we don't mark, because apparently somehow that's different. And when you sieve these, they come into lots of little different sections, the different sizes of sieving. And some of them are very, very tiny, the 0.5 mil, the 1 mil. Now, essentially, you do have little tiny, tiny crumbs of human remains in those bags, but they're completely useless for the osteologist. Anything below 2 millimeters, I can't identify, and I can't do any analysis on. What can I do with it? But essentially, you've got little tiny, tiny bits of human remains in those, but they can be very, very bulky. You can have really loads and loads of these bags and loads of these boxes. What do you do with them? Do you archive them? They're going to take up a lot of space. Is anybody ever going to use them? And this is something that, you know, we're having to decide on a case-by-case basis at the moment, and there's no guidance for it. There's nobody telling us this is what you do with your little bags of dust. And something else I thought about that nobody else really sort of talks about are the legal issues. Obviously, all the other fines and things apart from treasure, this has got a legal problem. And one thing that does come up quite a lot is when the site doesn't have a burial license. Now, you have to get one in advance, as hopefully everybody knows. But sometimes you don't get one for a site, you're not expecting to find a human remains, so you don't get one. Then you find a bit mixed in with the animal bone and you go, that's human. Now I haven't got a license for my site, I can't get it retrospectively. What do you do? And again, this is something we just then have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. There's also no guidance about reburials. Now, I know it's not really the ideal thing to do, and nobody really wants to rebury, but unfortunately we do. It's a fact. It's particularly post-medieval stuff, but we do have to rebury it. And again, there's no guidance on particularly how to record this for the archive, what sort of information needs to go in, where does it go in, etc. And one thing that unfortunately does come up from time to time is where the landowner has claimed the finds from the site and there's a skeleton or two also from that same site. And obviously we don't hand over the human remains. They can't claim that. There's no possession of a corpse. But what do you do then with the human remains? They are now split from the rest of the archive. So these are issues that are quite particular to human remains and not particularly any other kinds of finds. And just to quickly sort of finish off and to mention digital archiving, human remains are particularly problematic because we create a lot of digital data. People have their own databases. We take millions of digital photographs. We do all this beautiful photogrammetry, which produces like 50 million photos per skeleton. We take lots of photos for the destructive sampling. And so that's the only records that you have of that sort of tooth or bone before it then goes off to isotopic or radiocarbon. And so it's really, really digital heavy. And what do we do with all that? We can't keep everything. I'm pretty sure the ADS would cry if we send them absolutely everything we ever generated from our digital archive. And we could maybe, I know there's a lot of recommendations out there about digital archiving, but I think human remains generate a particular problem in that respect. So I'm afraid I don't actually have any answers today. In summary, I'd say the general feeling amongst osteologists is please don't mark on bone. But I say it's not clear cut, isn't that? It's not a definitive answer. Human remains are very demanding on storage space. Legal problems do and can occur, and they're really, really digital data heavy. And so I haven't really got the answers for you here, but these are just issues that definitely come up in my day-to-day existence as a human remains specialist. So, okay, thank you.